The call came through at 0317 station time, which meant doctor. Victor Hale had been awake for 22 hours and was halfway through his third cup of synthetic coffee when the magnetic resonance alarm split the silence of Outpost Vela 9 like something tearing. He didn't spill the coffee. That was the first thing he noticed about himself. Standing there with the mug still raised and the red emergency wish painting the walls of his office. He'd been on Oris Moon long enough that emergencies no longer made him flinch. They only made him move. He was already at the door when Ingrid caught up with him. She was his research assistant, his only colleague on Vela 9, and the kind of person who ran toward alarms instead of away from them. Which was, as far as Victor was concerned, the only qualification that mattered for anyone working this far from anything resembling civilization. Oris Moon sat at the outer edge of the Kaelan system, a frozen, magnetically volatile rock that the Kaelan Concordat had declared off-limits to human habitation 3 years prior. Victor had a research exemption. The exemption was currently under review. Lab? Ingrid said. Lab, he confirmed. They took the stairs 2 at a time. The Kaelan Concordat, the dominant interstellar governance body in this sector, a coalition of 4 alien species who had been navigating their collective differences for roughly 800 years, had made it very clear when humanity achieved first contact that they were not opposed to human presence in the outer systems. They were, however, intensely skeptical of human methodology. The Kaelan lived long and moved carefully, and believed in consensus above almost everything else. Humans tended to live short and move fast and believe in trying the thing first and figuring out the consequences second. This had not endeared them. Victor, specifically, had not endeared himself. He'd been xenobiologist at the First Contact Research Institute on Callaway Station when the whole thing went sideways. He'd had a Kaelan bioform sample, not a live specimen, a cellular culture, legally obtained, fully licensed, and he'd been running integration experiments, neural bridging. The theory was simple enough. If human neural tissue could be coaxed into forming stable resonance patterns with Kaelan cellular structures, it would represent a fundamental breakthrough in interspecies communication. Language was imprecise. Biology didn't lie. His rival at the institute, Dr. Marcus Clive, had walked into his lab unannounced on the day Victor ran the unauthorized full cortex integration test. Clive had stood in the doorway for exactly long enough to understand what he was seeing, and then he'd walked directly to the institute director's office and reported it. Victor lost his credentials inside a week. The experiment was classified. The culture sample was confiscated. He was told, in careful diplomatic language, that his approach to interspecies research was, quote, insufficiently regulated for the sensitivities of the current diplomatic moment. He'd said, the data was clean. They'd said the process was not. He'd accepted the research exemption on Vela 9 because it was the only place in 3 systems where he could keep working. Nobody else wanted the posting. The magnetic storms that rolled through every 40 to 60 days played hell with equipment, and the Kaelan had flagged the moon as biologically inert, which meant there was nothing here worth studying, which was what they thought. Victor had found the chamber 6 months into his posting, 20 meters below the permafrost, in a cavity that the geological surveys had missed because the magnetic interference made deep scans unreliable. The chamber was Kaelan in construction, ancient, pre-Concordat sealed, and inside it, in a suspension medium that had kept her stable for an estimated 300 years, was a Kaelan woman. He'd been calling her Eve. He had not reported her to the Concordat. He told himself this was because he needed more data before making a formal disclosure. That announcing a find of this magnitude without complete documentation would be scientifically irresponsible. He told himself this every morning and believed it less each time. The truth was simpler and more complicated. He was afraid they would take her away before he understood what she was. Her suspension medium was degrading. Her cellular structures showed signs of a neural architecture he'd never encountered in any Kaelan sample. She wasn't just preserved, she was waiting. Tonight, the magnetic storm that had been building for 3 days finally broke. The lab was 2 floors underground, reinforced against the storms, humming with the low-frequency harmonics that meant the magnetic field overhead was doing something violent. Victor pushed through the door and stopped. Ingrid stopped behind him. Eve was lying exactly where they had placed her, on the long steel platform at the center of the room, still dressed in the close-fitted environmental suit they'd transferred her to when the suspension medium failed. The monitoring equipment around her was going insane. Readings spiking and crashing, bioindicators cycling through values that shouldn't have been possible. The storm's magnetic discharge was feeding directly into the chamber through the geological formation beneath them, and the conduction was running straight into Eve's platform. And her platform was, apparently, conducting it into her. The readouts showed neural activity, not residual, not artifact, active, climbing, branching through her cortex in patterns that looked, and Victor knew this was his hope talking, but it looked like thought. "Victor," Ingrid said quietly, "I see it. I see it." He crossed to the monitoring station and pulled up the full cortex display. The branching was accelerating. The patterns were establishing feedback loops. He watched his hands move across the controls and realized distantly that they were shaking. Not from fear, but from something he hadn't felt since the classified experiment on Callaway, the specific electric certainty that something impossible was about to stop being impossible. "Her temperature's rising," Ingrid said, slowly, like a body warming itself. "She's metabolizing." The discharge gave her enough charge to restart cellular respiration. He pulled up the secondary display. "Her neural resonance is, Ingrid, her resonance frequency is shifting toward human baseline." Ingrid was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you think it means?" "I think it means the integration theory was right. Kalan neural architecture isn't incompatible with human patterns. It's adjacent. Given the right stimulus, the right proximity." He stopped. Started again. "I think she's been absorbing ambient human neural signal for 6 months. From us. Through the permafrost." "You think she's been listening to us?" "I think she's been learning us." He looked at the readouts. "And I think she just woke up." He stayed at the monitoring station for another 2 hours, cross-checking every reading, documenting the progression, running the numbers twice, and then a third time because the numbers were too good to trust on the first pass. Ingrid moved around the room behind him, adjusting equipment, keeping the secondary systems stable, doing the quiet and essential work of a person who understood that the moment required competence more than words. At some point, Victor became aware that he was exhausted in a way that had gotten ahead of him, and that if he didn't sleep for a few hours, he would start making errors. He told Ingrid he'd be back in 4 hours. He pulled on his jacket. He went upstairs. He was asleep for approximately 40 minutes when Ingrid called him. "She's awake," Ingrid said. "Fully. She's sitting up. Is she? She's not alarmed. A pause. She's looking at me like she's reading me." "Victor," she reached out and put her hand on my forearm, and I felt something. Like a sound inside my chest. Like resonance. He was already pulling on his boots. When he got back to the lab, Eve was sitting on the edge of the platform with her feet on the floor, and she was watching Ingrid with an expression Victor couldn't name. Not because it was alien, but because it was too precisely human. Attention, recognition, a kind of warmth that shouldn't have been possible from someone who had been suspended for 3 centuries and had woken up in a room full of strangers, from a species she should never have encountered. She looked at Victor. He felt it too then, the resonance Ingrid had described. A low harmonic that didn't come from his ears but from somewhere in his sternum, like a cello note played directly against the bone. Like being recognized by something that had no language for recognition and was using the only tool it had. He sat down on a lab stool and looked at her for a long time. "Hello?" he said, knowing she didn't have the word, knowing it was reflex, knowing it might matter anyway. She watched his mouth move. Then she made a sound, not a word, not language, something below language. The same frequency as what he'd felt in his chest, but shaped. Shaped maybe, like a greeting. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." He spent the next 8 days doing the most careful science of his life. Eve was ambulatory, cognitively active, and possessed of a neural architecture that was doing something extraordinary. It was rewriting itself in real time, establishing resonance links with the human neural patterns she'd been absorbing for months, building bridges across the gap between Kalan and human biology, with a speed and elegance that made Victor's classified experiment look like a child scribbling on a wall. She didn't speak. She communicated in harmonics, emotional, immediate, precise in a way that language rarely was. She learned Ingrid's gestures and started using them. She learned the layout of the outpost and navigated it without being shown. She looked at Victor's research notes, and he had the distinct impression she was reading them, though she'd never been exposed to any human written language. On the 9th day, Victor made the decision he'd been circling. "We have to take her to the Concordat." Ingrid looked up from her work. "They'll confiscate her. Like they confiscated the culture samples. Maybe. But they need to see her. What she is, What's happened to her? It's proof that the integration theory works, that we can bridge the gap. That it's not possible, but that it happens naturally, given proximity and time. He looked at Eve, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor near the far wall, doing something with her hands that might have been meditation. She's not an experiment, she's evidence. And the evidence needs to be seen. By the people who revoked your credentials, yes. By the tribunal that classified your last research, yes. Ingrid was quiet for a moment. Then, what happens to her if it goes wrong? I don't know. He was honest about it, but I know what happens if we stay here. The exemption is up for review in 6 weeks. When they revoke it, they'll scan the station. They'll find the chamber. They'll find the suspensions records. They'll take her anyway, without any of the documentation, without any of the context. He paused. If I bring her to them, at least I control the narrative. You've never controlled a narrative in your life, Ingrid said. But she was already pulling up the transport request form. The Kalan Concordat held its scientific review tribunals on a station called the Iterum, a vast disc-shaped structure that hung in stable orbit above the Kalan home system and served, among many other functions, as the formal setting for any interspecies scientific dispute. Victor had appeared before a tribunal here once before, when his credentials were revoked. He remembered the hall, its curved walls, the way sound moved strangely in the space, the 7-seat adjudication panel arranged in a semicircle at one end. He remembered standing at the center of that semicircle and feeling very specifically like a single organism that had wandered into the sensory range of something much larger. This time he walked in with Eve on his left and Ingrid on his right, and he kept his pace steady. He had dressed Eve in a human researcher's uniform, gray, functional, the same as Ingrid's. He had briefed Ingrid on the cover story. Eve was a Kalan human cultural liaison, joining them as a research consultant. The strategy was direct, borrowed from every field study he'd ever read about first contact. Don't announce what you have. Let them encounter it naturally. Let them form a response before they form a position. Dr. Marcus Clive was already in the hall when they arrived. Victor had not expected this. He should have. Clive had been the one to report him 4 years ago, which meant Clive had a stake in this tribunal. He was standing near the far wall with a woman Victor didn't recognize. A fellow xenobiologist from the Institute, probably, given the credentials badge. When Victor entered, Clive looked up and their eyes met. And Clive smiled the way a man smiles when he believes he holds an advantage. Victor had been watching people hold advantages over him for 4 years. He was very calm about it. The tribunal opened formally. 7 adjudicators, a mix of the 4 concordate species, seated in their semicircle. The lead adjudicator, a Kalan elder named Velsorn, white-crested, slow-moving, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that stillness was its own form of power, opened the session by noting that Dr. Hale had requested a formal review of the research conducted at Outpost Vela 9, and that the Concordat would hear his submission. Victor stood at the center of the semicircle. He introduced Ingrid. He introduced Eve as his cultural liaison, watching the adjudicator's reactions with the practiced attention of a man who had spent years reading alien biology and had learned that bodies told the truth even when languages didn't. Several of the adjudicators noted Eve's presence. One, a younger Kalan, third seat from the left, held their gaze on her slightly too long. Victor gave his opening statement. The integration theory, the mathematics of neural resonance, the evidence from the culture sample experiments, which had been classified, but which he had the right to present in a formal tribunal context. He kept his voice even. He watched the adjudicators watch him. Clive interrupted twice, both times with procedural objections. Both were noted and set aside. 40 minutes into the session, Velsorn called a brief recess. Victor moved to the side of the hall, where Ingrid and Eve were waiting. He was reaching for his notes when Clive materialized beside him. She's not a liaison, Clive said quietly. I know who the registered liaisons are for every institution in this sector. She's not in any database. Victor looked at him. The Concordat's liaison registry isn't publicly accessible. I have access. Clive's smile was careful, calibrated. And I'll be submitting a formal identification request before the session resumes. He paused. Whatever you've brought here, Victor, it's going to be mine inside an hour. The same way the culture samples were mine. He tilted his head. You should have stayed on the moon. Victor said nothing. Clive moved away. Victor stood still for a moment. Then he turned to Ingrid and said quietly, he's going to trigger a biometric scan. I know. When the scanner reads her, they'll know what she is before I can contextualize it. They'll shut down the session. I know. He looked at Eve. She was watching the hall with that expression he'd stopped trying to name, the precise luminous attention of something that processed the world differently and was, at this particular moment, processing it with complete focus, as if she could feel the shift in the room, as if she already knew. She looked at him. The harmonic moved through his chest, not alarmed, not urging, just present, an acknowledgement. He made a decision. Change of plan, he said. He walked back to the center of the semicircle before the recess ended. Vel Sorn looked up from their consultation with mild surprise. The other adjudicators settled. I'd like to revise my submission, Victor said. I'm not going to make the theoretical case. I'm going to make the empirical one. He turned to the hall and said clearly, Eve. She walked forward. She walked to the center of the semicircle and stood beside him, and the 7 adjudicators looked at her with varying degrees of attention, and the third seat, the younger Kalen, who had watched her too long, sat very still. This is Eve, Victor said. She is a Kalen woman who was placed in suspended animation in a pre-Concordat chamber beneath the permafrost of Orus Moon approximately 300 years ago. I discovered her 6 months ago. I did not report the discovery immediately. He paused. That was wrong. I'm correcting it now. The hall was very quiet. During the 6 months of her suspension, after I discovered the chamber, Eve was exposed to ambient human neural signal from my research station. Kalen neural architecture, as my classified research demonstrated 4 years ago, is resonance adjacent to human patterns. Given sustained proximity and sufficient time, it self-modifies. It builds bridges. He looked at the adjudicators. Eve has been building bridges for 6 months. What she is right now is not what she was when she went into suspension. She is something that has never existed before. She is proof that the gap between our species is not a gap at all. It's a frequency difference. And frequency differences can be resolved. Vel Sorn said, very carefully, you are claiming that a Kalen woman has developed a resonance bond with human neural patterns. I'm not claiming it. I'm showing it. Victor looked at Eve. She didn't need to be prompted. She had been listening to the harmonic of the room for the past hour, reading the emotional architecture of 7 adjudicators the way she read everything. Through the body, through the frequency. She turned to face Vel Sorn. She made a sound. It wasn't language, it was the frequency. The same low harmonic that Victor felt in his chest, but directed now, shaped with precision, aimed at the adjudication panel with the specificity of someone who had learned exactly what register moved each one of them. Vel Sorn went very still. The third seat adjudicator made a sharp, involuntary motion, not alarm, not rejection, but the physical response of a nervous system encountering something it already knew. Recognition. The same recognition Victor had felt in the lab on Vela 9, sitting on a stool in the dark, saying hello into a silence that turned out not to be silence at all. Clive stood up from his seat at the side of the hall. This is irregular, he said. The subject should be scanned before any. Sit down, Vel Sorn said. Clive sat. Vel Sorn looked at Eve for a long moment. Then they looked at Victor. Their expression was unreadable in the way that Kalen faces were often unreadable. Not blank, but deep, the way a still lake was deep, carrying everything that moved beneath it. How long did you know, Vel Sorn asked, that she was building bridges, from the first day she was awake? That it would work this way? Victor thought about the culture sample experiments, the classified data. The 4 years of working from the outside of every institution that had ever given him a platform. He thought about Eve sitting cross-legged on the lab floor, doing something with her hands that might have been meditation. He thought about what it meant to believe a thing was true before you could prove it, and to keep believing it until proof became possible. I knew the theory was right, he said. I didn't know if she'd be willing. He looked at Eve. She was still holding the harmonic. It was in the room now, moving through the walls, through the floor, through the air handlers and the circuit panels and the bones of the Iterum structure, quiet and everywhere, the way a river was quiet when it was also the entire valley. Clive was on his feet again. He had his scanning unit out. A portable biometric device, the kind used for formal identification, and he was moving toward the center of the room. I have a right to submit a formal identification request, he said. Station protocol. Marcus, Victor said, not loudly. Clive didn't stop. He crossed the floor, closed the distance, and activated the scanner. The biometric field hit Eve like a wave, striking something that was not quite the shape the wave expected. The scanner's resonance field, calibrated for standard Kalen biology, as all Concordat biometrics were, encountered a neural architecture that was standard Kalen, and also something else, and the something else resonated back, and the resonance was at a frequency the scanner was not designed to contain. Victor would reconstruct this later, with Ingrid, poring over the readings in the days that followed, building the sequence from the data. What happened in the room happened fast, so fast that it registered mostly as sensation rather than event. The scanner's resonance field amplified on contact with Eve's modified neural architecture. Her nervous system, already running hot from the sustained effort of maintaining the harmonic in a room full of active alien biofields, hit a feedback threshold it couldn't regulate. Victor saw her expression shift, not pain, not fear, but the specific, clarified focus of something that has decided to do a thing all the way or not at all. She opened. The resonance wasn't a sound anymore. It was an event. It moved through the room like a wave through deep water, not violent, not destructive, but total. The way certain kinds of truth were total, leaving nothing outside their edges. Every person in that hall felt it in the place below language, in the place where the body stored its oldest knowledge. The adjudicators. The officials at the side tables. Clive standing 3 feet from her with his scanner frozen in his hand. Victor and Ingrid against the wall, holding onto each other by the elbow without either of them deciding to. It lasted 6 seconds, Victor counted. Then Eve made a sound. The last one, high and clean and final, like the last note of something very long. And the energy discharged all at once, the way the magnetic storm had discharged on Oris Moon, the way things that had been building for a very long time tended to discharge when they finally found their ground. She came apart in light, not fire, not violence. Light, and then the absence of light, and then the room settling back into itself with a quality it hadn't had before. A kind of depth, a residue, as if the air had been permanently changed by what had moved through it. Clive's scanner was reading nothing. He stood in the center of the empty semicircle, staring at the space where Eve had been, and his face had the expression of a man who had been certain of something for years, and had just been shown, with extraordinary clarity, that his certainty was a very small thing in a very large space. Victor walked to the center of the room. His legs were steady. This surprised him because the rest of him was not. There was something at the back of his throat that he was managing, carefully, and his hands were doing the shaking again, both of them this time, and he made himself breathe through it. Velsorn was looking at him. She discharged, Velsorn said. The resonance, resonance overload, Victor said. Her nervous system was human adjacent but not human. The scanner's field was the wrong frequency at the wrong amplitude. He paused. I didn't anticipate the scanner. No. A silence. Neither did we. Victor looked at the adjudicators. All 7 of them. He looked at their faces, which were doing things that Kellen faces did not typically do in formal sessions. Open things, uncertain things. The physiological traces of having just had something move through them that they hadn't expected and couldn't fully categorize. You felt her, he said. It was not a question. No one answered immediately. Then the third seat adjudicator, the young one, the one who had watched Eve from the moment she walked in, said, very quietly, yes. That was 6 months of proximity. 6 months of ambient signal absorbed through permafrost and lab walls, metabolized by a neural architecture that was already capable of the resonance, that had always been capable of it, that only needed the exposure. Victor looked at his hands, which had mostly stopped shaking. Eve was 300 years old. She was not human, but she felt us across 6 months in a meter of frozen rock, and she built a bridge, because that is what neural systems do when they encounter something adjacent. They find the frequency and they match it. He looked at Velsorn. The gap between your species and mine is not a gap. It never was. It's a distance, and distance can be crossed. Clive was still standing in the center of the room. He looked very small. Victor had never thought of Marcus Clive as small. I want my research restored, Victor said. Not classified. Reviewed, published, and attributed. I want the culture sample data released. I want a formal research commission established to study resonance integration with full concordat support. He stopped. And I want it noted in the official record of this session that the evidence for today's submission was not a theory, and was not a simulation, and was not a manipulation. His voice was very steady. He was surprised by how steady it was. It was a person who woke up 300 years after she was supposed to, in a room full of humans, and decided we were worth knowing. The hall was quiet for a long time. Then Velsorn said, the session will recess for deliberation. They recessed for 11 hours. Victor sat in the waiting area outside the hall with Ingrid, and they didn't talk much. Ingrid had her hand on his arm, and he didn't move it. He was thinking about Eve. Not what she had been, Not what her discharge meant for the data, but the 9 days in the lab when she had been alive and present and learning them. He was thinking about the way she had looked at him on the first day, that precise, luminous attention, the harmonic in his chest, the feeling of being recognized by something that had no language for it and used its body instead. He thought, she knew. Not what would happen, not the exact shape of the discharge, but she knew she was evidence, and she knew what evidence was for. And she had walked into that hall and stood at the center of the semicircle and opened herself all the way, held nothing back, given every frequency she had built in 6 months of listening through the dark. He was not going to be able to talk about that for a while. He filed it carefully. When the hall reconvened, Velsorn read the deliberation findings in the particular measured cadence of formal Kalen proceedings, and Victor listened to the words that contained his restored credentials, the research commission, the declassification order, and did not let himself react until the final finding was read. The formal acknowledgement entered into the Concordat record that the resonance event of this session constituted empirical evidence of viable interspecies neural integration. And then he let himself breathe. Clive left without speaking to him. Victor didn't watch him go. He was watching Velsorn instead, who had paused at the edge of the hall and turned back once, and looked at him with an expression that might, in a human face, have been something like wonder. She was very old, Velsorn said. What she became in 6 months it is, they paused. In 800 years of the Concordat we have not seen this. No, Victor said. We haven't. Will it be repeatable? He thought about it. The real answer, the scientific answer, was that he didn't know. That Eve's particular architecture, her particular age, her particular circumstances, might have made her an outlier, a single data point that proved the concept without guaranteeing replication. He thought about all the ways that answer was true. Then he thought about what it meant that she had done it at all, that the architecture was there, that the adjacent frequency existed, that everything the Concordat had classified and suppressed and labeled insufficiently regulated had been right. Not in the way a lucky guess was right, but in the way a law of physics was right, present and operational whether or not anyone acknowledged it. Yes, he said, it'll be repeatable. He didn't know if he was promising or predicting. He thought, in this particular case, it was probably both. They transported back to Velenine 2 days later, him and Ingrid and the equipment cases, and the Commission's first formal research directive, which named Victor as principal investigator and gave him a budget and a timeline and everything he needed to start again. The moon was quiet when they arrived. The magnetic storm had passed. The permafrost was solid and pale under the work lights, and the chamber below it was empty now, the suspension platform clean and cold, and Victor stood in it for a while before he went back upstairs to work. Ingrid found him there. She stood in the doorway and looked at him looking at the empty chamber, and she didn't say anything for a moment, which was something Victor appreciated about Ingrid. She knew when a thing needed to sit. Then she said, "What do you want to do first?" He thought about the chamber. He thought about the geological survey maps, the ones that had missed this one because the magnetic interference made deep scans unreliable. He thought about the fact that he had 6 months left on his exemption, now extended to 3 years by the Commission directive, and 3 years of budget and a cleared research record, and the specific, electric certainty that the data was right. Deep survey, he said. Full spectrum, compensated for magnetic interference. Find out what else the original scans missed. You think there are others. I think this moon is 3 billion years old, and the Kaolin have been in this system for 800 years, and the chamber we found was pre-Concordat. He looked at the suspension platform. I think we haven't been listening long enough to know what we don't know. Ingrid was quiet for a moment. And if we find others, then we do it again. He turned away from the chamber, carefully, slowly, with the right frequencies and enough time. He pulled his jacket on. That's what she taught me. You don't force the resonance. You show up and you're present, and you let it build. They went upstairs. Above them, through 2 floors of permafrost and rock and the electromagnetic silence of a moon at rest between storms, the Kalen system turned in its ancient orbit, and somewhere in the memory of a governing body that had been navigating its own frequencies for 800 years, there was a new note, quiet, low, everywhere, that had not been there before the morning a dead woman woke up in a room full of humans and decided they were worth the effort. It did not have a name yet, it would.